All right, so that ends our macrofauna, and we're now moving on to mesofauna. So these are the smaller animals. Some of these you can see with your naked eye, some you might need a microscope. So we're going to include the arthropods, and we're going to have our springtails and protura and mites. And then in annelids, we have small worms called potworms. We talked about the Anchitridae. So these are different than the earthworm annelids. We find a ton of mites every year when we do our leaf litter samples. Typically, the conifer forest has so many of them, like hundreds. So many that the students can't count them all. Instead, we put them in a petri dish, we draw squares, and we count how many are in like 3 squares, and then extrapolate, because it's just crazy. The ones that we typically find are the Oribitae. They look like little teardrops. They're mostly detrivores. They're an important part of the ecosystem because they're so common. These are not ticks. They look a lot like ticks. They're in the same family as ticks. Other mites we get are astigmata, mesostigmata, and prostigmata. I don't want to go, I could go through everything, but we're probably only going to find the Oripitae, unless, see, you guys are at your houses, you might be getting leaf litters from all over the place. You might find some of these. Typically, I don't in the soils that we go to around the campus, but you might find some astigmata. They're really common on farms where you have high nitrogen levels. So anyway, those are mites. Springtails, my favorite. They're called springtails because they have this projection off of their bottoms that allow them to hop and spring. They are one of the most plentiful soil invertebrates. So mites and nematodes are our 2 most plentiful. Springtails are right up there. They're mostly feeding on mycorrhiza, fungal hyphae, so like the root systems of fungus and bacteria. But they'll also eat decaying matter. We think they're key in helping these microfungi spread their spores. We're not completely sure though. We're still learning. There's a lot of unknowns when we come to springtails. So these are the winter ones that we see all the time. If you have a footprint in the snow on a warm day, it'll fill up with these springtails. Proturans, we'll definitely see some springtails. We might see some proturans. For a long time, people thought they were springtails. Neither of these are insects per se. They're like proto-insects. But proturans have no antenna. They live in the top layer of the litter. They're usually right near the surface. They don't like acidic soils, which is why we don't usually see them in our soil samples on campus. But if some of you are in southern Ontario where you have a limestone soil, maybe you will. I don't know. I'll be interested to see. But because they're so similar to springtails in a lot of ways, generally we're assuming they have a similar niche. But you could become the next proturan scientist and teach us all about these guys. And then our next mesofauna are enchytraid worms, or potworms, or white worms. These guys eat bacteria and fungus. They like acidic soils, wet acidic soils. So we do see them in the forests, but they're really common in composting. If your compost becomes too acidic, you will see a lot of these worms. And that's why they're called potworms, because people would get them when planting plants when the soil becomes too acidic. Then you'll get this like explosion of these little white worms everywhere. And they're harmless to humans. They're eating the explosion of bacteria and fungus that are growing in that wet, acidic soil.